Hello Fischer fans, welcome to Chess DNA. In today's video we are covering the game 3 from the famous Bobby Fischer's book My 60 Memorable Games. And in game 1 and 2 we saw how beautifully Fischer managed to beat his very strong opponents Sherwin and Bent Larsen at a very young age of 14 and 15. And in game 3, the opponent of Fischer is not an ordinary player. There are good chess players, and then there are good grandmasters in chess, and then there are good or great world champions in chess. But Tigran Petrosian is considered to be one of the greatest players to ever play chess. He was the 9th world champion from 1963 to 1969, and he was known for his tremendously beautiful positional and defensive style of play. He would love to lock the positions in the center and then play on the flanks and outflank their opponent, outplay their opponent on his opponents on the flanks. And he was not just a great positional player, but also a very, very strong tactician. So he would often combine these tactics with positional ideas in order to give his opponents a bear hug. And that's the title of the game that Fischer has chosen for this one, bear hug. He thinks that Petrosian used to play these little innocuous moves that were suffocating his opponents as if a bear was hugging them. And often he would just exchange his pieces and slowly build up a position where he would slowly get some kind of advantage and then materialize that advantage into a tangible winning advantage. So let's see how Fischer combats Tigran Petrosian, who is a Soviet giant of chess. And Bobby Fischer is just 15 years old American kid. Let's see how he combats Petrosian style of play in this beautiful game number 3 in his book, My 60 Memorable Games. So let's dive right into it. Petrosian starts with the English opening c4, and Fischer's choice was knight f6, knight c3, g6, g3, bishop g7, bishop g2, and castles. So Fischer chooses his favorite King's Indian defense, and that's the characteristics of King's Indian defense when you fianchetto your dark square bishop on the g7 square and immediately castle and just get to safety, and then you want to play d6. So Petrosian continues with knight f3 and Fischer goes d6. If here d5 is played, then it can transpose into some sort of Grunfeld defense. But Fischer, at his early stage of the career, he preferred the King's Indian a lot, and he chose d6. There is no surprise in that. Petrosian castles. Fischer develops the knight to c6 and d3. If Petrosian played d4, he would transpose into some mainline King's Indian, but d3 is to throw Fischer a little bit off of his book to test his positional understanding of the game of chess. So let's see how Fischer combats. He goes knight h5. He unlocks his dark square bishop and is also ready to push this f pawn up the board to attack the white king, and that's a standard idea in the King's Indian defense. And now Petrosian is happy to transpose into some mainline King's Indian by pushing that pawn one step further to the d4 square. So let's see how Fischer responds. He responds with the most standard response, which is e5. He wants to follow it up with f5 and f4 in order to launch an attack on the white king right off the opening. And Petrosian, he was a great positional player. He would love to lock the center and then play on the flanks, so leaves us with no surprise that he would never capture the pawn, and he played to lock the position d5, gain a lot of space in the center, kicking Fischer's knight back to the e7 square, and then he plays e4 to cement his central structure of pawns in the center, so he has a lot of space advantage. And Fischer's idea now would be to play f5 and hit that pawn chain's bottom of the pawn chain and create an attack on the king's side. That's the standard idea in the King's Indian anyways. Fischer goes f5 and Petrosian actually captures the pawn. He is not allowing Fischer to continue marching that pawn up the board, because then if he takes, then knight is going to be beautifully placed on the f4 square. His rook is going to be active. Bishop is going to be involved in the game, and that's going to be really nice for Fischer. So he immediately captures. Now, a question for you guys. What would you recapture that pawn with? Would you recapture with this knight? Would you recapture with a rook? Or would you recapture with a bishop? Well, it turns out all of these moves are bad, because Petrosian always has this idea of h3, g4, forking the pieces on these squares. So you must always keep in mind, whenever your minor pieces or major pieces are one square apart, there could be forking ideas and pieces could get pushed back. So the best way to recapture is to recapture with a pawn, keeping that dynamic element and the energy in the pawn, because now they are controlling a lot of squares in the white's territory. And the downside is that this knight has lost its defender from g6, so it's under attack by the white's queen. So if this knight moves away, then queen would be capturing that knight on h5. And Petrosian immediately takes advantage of that and grabs this pawn on e5, unleashing an attack on that undefended knight on h5. So Fischer thinks that he's going to lose that knight anyways, so he plays a desperado move. What's a desperado move, guys? Desperado move especially is so associated with the knight, when the knight is supposed to be lost anyways, so he grabs anything that he can grab in order to sell itself for the highest price. So Fischer does that. He grabs the g3 pawn and counterattacks the rook. So now if Petrosian decides to save the knight, then it's of no use because Fischer is attacking the rook. So he grabs the knight on g3, and then Fischer grabs with the bishop. Now he can actually grab with the pawn and get that pawn duo again in the center, but these pawns are going to be very vulnerable because these are now considered as hanging pawns. They have to be defended by pieces, and not just that, Petrosian's idea is going to be very clear. He will run these pawns down the queen side and create a passer. He already has a very strong advanced d5 pawn, and he will love to convert it into a passed pawn and get a very strong positional grip on Fischer. So Fischer does not want that. For that reason, he captures with the bishop, and now f4, kicking the bishop back to g7 square. And now Petrosian's idea is to develop bishop to d4 in order to exchange it with very strong dark square bishop for black, which is just cutting this board into two halves, just slicing it down on that dark square diagonal. So Petrosian's idea is very beautiful. He sees a good piece of black, he wants to trade it with his own pieces in order to decrease the power of black pieces. Fischer develops his light square bishop to d7, bishop d4, knight is better placed on g6, from where it is basically stopping that g4 push, so that knight is always threatening to jump into that h4 square. So Petrosian improves his rook to the e1 square. Now, if you look at this position, can you come up with an idea how to basically activate your last piece that is still left in the game? Rook on a8 is not doing anything. And how Fischer achieves this is very beautiful. Fischer thinks that this white rook is really active and my black rook on a8 is not doing anything. So a very clever plan by Fischer in order to trade that stupid rook that is not doing anything on a8 exchange it with a very active white rook on e1. So let's see how he does it. He starts with rook f7. Petrosian improves his bishop to f3, and now queen to f8. Petrosian improves the king to the f2 square, and now he brings that rook that was not doing anything to the e8 square and exchanges it off with the active rook of white on e1. And look at that, the queen is still there, but white's rook on a8 has disappeared, and black's rook on a8 has disappeared, and white's rook on e1 has disappeared, which was controlling that file very actively at the cost of some tempo, because Fischer allowed the bishop to improve to f3 and the king to h2. So little improvement has achieved by Petrosian, but black's major problem, the rook was never going to get involved in the game, he's managed to exchange it off with a very active rook of white. So that's how great positional players play chess. And this gives us an idea that Fischer is not just a great attacking player, he understood the positional aspect of the game as well. Kind of, we see that bishop is attacking on a7, but Petrosian is never going to capture, because then b6 is going to come and trap that bishop. So Petrosian actually trades it off with a very strong dark square bishop on g7. Fischer recaptures it back with a rook, and now queen d4, centralizing the queen. And now queen is basically creating this threat to capture, because queen is never going to get trapped. It's going to evacuate itself to some squares here on that a file. So Fischer actually defends it by going b6. And now Petrosian is trying to improve his pieces, trying to build up pressure on some of the weaknesses that Fischer has on the king side. Fischer improves his pawn on, gains a little bit of space on the a5 by pushing the pawn on a5 on the queen side. And now Petrosian is trying to remaneuver his knight to some better square, putting some pressure on that weak f5 pawn. Queen f8, knight e3, rook f7, and now b3. Petrosian is building this very solid pawn chain on the light squares, and after the queens got exchanged, there is some reshuffling of the pieces. Basically what Petrosian is doing is trying to attack that weak pawn on f5 so that Fischer has his pieces defending that pawn, so they are tied up to the defense, and then Petrosian can improve the king and transition into a favorable endgame. But Fischer is not allowing Petrosian to keep a constant pressure on f5, so he goes bishop e8, targeting that rook. Rook goes back, and now bishop back to d7. So Fischer has kind of offered a draw by, Petrosian again goes rook h5, Fischer can repeat the position, and it will be an instant threefold repetition, a draw. But Petrosian wants to fight on because he has the white pieces and he wants to take his chances. So some reshuffling of the pieces. There are some pawns exchanged on the queen side. Petrosian has managed to bring his rook onto the A file, and he wants to, attack these weaknesses that Fischer has on the queen side. But Fischer has calculated it very nicely, and he defends everything very beautifully on the queen side. There is no pawn break as such that Petrosian gets a passed pawn, but after the knight is improved to the beautiful e5 square, it's hitting that bishop. Petrosian actually decides to capture it. And it happens when you're playing a very strong player and he's countering your ideas, and you are just trying to make new plans. You're consuming a lot of mental energy, a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of stamina in order to build up a plan, and your opponent is just playing prophylactically, defending your plans, and is fighting against your plans. Then you get tired, and then you just want to trade it off into an equal endgame and just call it a draw, and appreciate your opponent for not making any mistake and shake hands, and you both leave the board happily without anybody losing. So Petrosian now decides to trade off some pieces and just transition into an equal endgame. And this is just a child's play for both of these players to maintain this position to a draw. And Fischer thought that he would just probably get some activity, but both of these players are such great players that they know that at this point it's just a draw. Fischer gets his king near to that white rook so that it can threaten to capture it or promote to another queen. But Petrosian has an excellent endgame knowledge, and he understands that these two connected passed pawns are going to be overwhelming that rook, and it will be a draw. So after some more moves, when f7 is played, both players agree to a draw, because if now rook f8, then g7 can be played, but then rook takes on f7. If you promote to another queen, then the move is king to b2, and it's impossible to stop that pawn. Petrosian can take on f7, but then there is this c2 move, and then it's just a draw. Whenever the pawn is on the c or the f file, it's always considered a draw against the queen. That's a theoretical endgame position, because every time, like let's say you bring the queen in, there is always, there is idea to promote to another queen. So that's going to just be a draw. If you give a check, then of course there is this idea to play king a1, just moving that king to the corner of the board. And now if you, for example, attack the pawn, then the king can just come back. And if you just keep giving checks, king a1, you can just keep doing that, check and check, you just save the pawn. And anytime you, let's say, for example, here, let's say you give this, you make this move, you're always, allowing the king to come back, defend the pawn. But there are some stalemate ideas in this position as well. For example, check, king actually goes to a1, and let's say you play queen a4 check, king goes back here, and let's say queen b3 check. If now king goes back to a1, the problem is that you cannot take on c2 here, because that would be a stalemate. And both of these players respect each other a lot, that they understand that this is going to be a draw. And since they played a beautiful game anyway, so they understand that they respect each other, so they not test each other's endgame knowledge, and they understand that it's a draw, so they called it a day. And it was a very beautiful game by a young Bobby Fischer. Later, in his career, he even beat Petrosian, gave Petrosian a very tough time with his attacking style of play. But early in his career, it's incredible to see a 15-year-old American kid is giving the greatest Soviet giants of all time a really hard time, and they are not able to beat that kid. So it's incredible to see how Fischer manages to do that at a young age. And we'll be seeing what happens in the game 4 of the book. I hope you guys enjoyed game 3 and got to learn a lot from Bobby Fischer and Petrosian. Both are legends. I love both of the players. So you guys can let me know in the comment what do you think about this game, or what are your suggestions for the channel, anything you want, and I'll be definitely taking that into account. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Have a good day. Bye.